Hey everyone, how is it going? Today I will be covering a live demo of what I've developed so far for this blog post, and I'm hoping to actually do a little bit of live product development just to show you all a little bit about how I think about poker and how I kind of try to draw parallels between how I want to use the tool, how it should look, how it should flow into my poker playing routine, and then how I actually then begin to develop those features, especially as someone who is not actually a software engineer or professional developer by trade in any means. I have a lot of data experience, a lot of analytics experience, which is probably why I enjoy poker so much, but I am not actually good at coding at all, especially as it relates to front end and back end. Once I get out of SQL, out of the data world, I'm completely lost. So anyway, we're going to start poker first because I think that's realistically what most of us are excited to see. And you'll see that I've decided to call this Poker Companion. Really important reason for why I chose that specific word. And I think even though tools like PioSolver, GTO Wizard, all these tools are really helpful, they can help you understand theory, you always have to go somewhere else. And I feel like the workflow is very distorted. You finish a session, you look at maybe some tagged hands, you do a little bit of analysis, and then you go to some other tool, some other solution that's way out in the middle of nowhere, and you learn, and then it's really difficult to be able to connect your learnings from what you took from the solver back to your play, especially as it relates to particular hands. And so the whole goal of Poker Companion, from my perspective, is what I'm envisioning is as soon as you're done playing, you can immediately pull this out and then see how well you played, irrespective of the results. Did you win? Did you lose? Didn't matter. Did you play well? Did you make mistakes? Did you adjust to the pool in your population correctly? And in order to do that, that means we're actually having some very tight synergies with Poker Tracker 4. So just as kind of a highlight of what I did in order to get the software as it's for me to this state, I can come up here over to import hands. And right now this just exists for Poker Tracker 4, but the thought would be the same for Hold'em Manager or Hand to Know. We simply connect the database and then we can import all the hands. And what this is doing is it's taking all the data from Poker Tracker 4 and it's bringing it into the native database of this application, which is literally on the scale of like 50 times faster. So it's going to be able to enable a lot more insights, a lot more dynamic analytics, instead of waiting 30 seconds for your Poker Tracker 4 report to spin when you just want to look at your last 1,000 hands. This literally imported the 2 million hands I have in my database, which is I think like over 17 gigabytes in 7 minutes, and subsequent session runs take like 30 seconds. So like I play 1,000 session hand, and by the time you could even go to the bathroom or grab a coffee, it's done, it's ready, you get to review your play. And that's kind of the goal. Again, really leaning into as soon as you finish your session, let's get in and figure out how we can improve and how we can start building trading things. And so a lot of this is basically coming around this idea of studying. And so before we can think about how we do it in an overall session, you'll notice that I have this coming soon. I haven't built out the exact session page. We want to be able to look at particular hands. And so automatically, this tagged hand section here is going to go through and pull all of the hands that we tagged, and we can go through and begin looking at those. But then I also have some of the functionality being built out so that we could sort for a date range or a date picker. Maybe we only want to look at our biggest pots. I'll mess with this slider. I only want to see the pots that I played that were over 153 big blinds. We hit search. This just went through all 2 million of my hands and returned everything that I was a part of, where the overall pot size got to be above 150 big blinds. And then the goal then is going to be able to just quickly dive into that. So I'll click on this Ace King hand here, and it's immediately going to then bring up the street breakdown and then the hand history. This is a little bug. I'll fix that later. But what's going on here is it's then trying to say for each phase of the game, how can we actually begin to grade and evaluate what's happening. So in this case, this was small blind versus button. I opened, and this actually looks to be a 3-bet, so I was supposed to 3-bet Ace King, and then it looks like in this case, I don't know, it was like a jam. This is a bad example. Maybe we look at some more like normal hands. we'll just look at this 10-8 hand. This was a big blind defense versus open. So the mid position opened. I called with 10-8. That was the incorrect action because it wasn't theory approved in this sense. But my goal is not to just have this be what's possible in theory, but is it a good move based on what we know about the population? And so one of the things that I built out early on was the idea of how can we do pool analysis. So I have over 10,000 players in my pool that I have hands on from everything that I've collected so far. And what I wanted to be able to do was then actually look at these and break down some of these statistics into much more of a genomic, meaningful way of describing what that player is. And so I took that into 7 pre-flop traits and 7 post-flop traits. So in this case, we have tight versus loose. How many hands do they play effectively? Discipline versus fishy. This is looking at the amount of times they make mistakes like cold calling too much from cold calling too much, basically calling any time not in the blinds, open limping, cold calling 3-bets, effectively looking for all of those types of actions that happen within the database, and then counting essentially the number of mistakes. So a player who makes more of those mistakes is going to be really fishy. A player who doesn't make many of them all is going to be disciplined. And then the same thing down the line, passive versus aggressive. How are they entering the pot? Is it via calling? Is it via raising? Selective versus provocative. This is saying effectively just how often they're going to take extremely aggressive actions such as squeezes, 3-bets, and 4-bets. And then cautious and curious. This is, are they going to fold a lot when facing raises? Are they going to call a lot? Yielding resistant is going to be the same, but against like really aggressive action. So if they raise and then face another aggressive action, are they more likely to fold or more likely to call? And then uncalibrated versus aggressive here is essentially trying to say, like, how much of the understanding does somebody actually have of the game? You should be opening less hands from under the gun than small blind, for example. This is measuring those ratios. So someone who's really exaggerated might be overstealing the blinds and is over aware of that positional dynamic and how late people are to act, whereas someone completely uncalibrated is going to be opening the exact same range of hands as they might from later in the sequence. And one of the cool things that maybe not cool, one of the things I really tried to focus on was to make these into tangible, easy to digest concepts that we should all understand instead of trying to get too specifically tied up in a number like VPIP. Is 28 good? Is 29 good? In our minds, like, right, we just want to understand kind of these broader heuristics so that we can quickly categorize players, tag them, and identify the exploits needed. And the same thing is going to exist here for all the post-flop traits. So subdued versus relentless is, as the aggressor, how often are they betting? Are they triple burying a lot? Are they just c-betting and giving up? Flight or fight would be when they're the aggressor, are they likely to like fold when probed against or stabbed against? Or are they going to fight for pots? They're going to check raise. Reserve versus dominating is all about the types of sizing they use. So someone who's very dominating is going to be using huge sizing. Reserved is going to be small. Reacting versus probing. This is then as the caller. Are you someone who's just going to go in the flow of the game, or are you going to dunk? Are you going to lead? Are you going to stab? It's looking at all those types of behaviors. Nitty versus sticky, self-explanatory. Are they folding? Are you calling a lot? Contain versus volatile is all going to be around aggressive actions, post-flop, like pre-flop, or like raises and 3-bets. And then meek, strong, just again trying to capture the dynamic of how someone might be different as the aggressor versus as the defender. So this is again looking at that bet size, but when they're calling and entering the pot via passive lines. And so all these sliders effectively are going to represent the entire player pool. And then we click on something like studied reg, that is then going to shift to show where these types of players fit on the spectrum of the overall population or your pool at large. So in this case, of the roughly 10,000 players that I said that I had, 3,300 of them are this type studied reg. I made up the term, but whatever. We're not going to pay attention too much to post-flop because this is strictly a pre-flop player type. So in this case, we can see that majority of them are definitely very tight. They're playing way fewer hands than the population at large. This pretty much kind of goes with what we know. Some of the more disciplined, better players are going to be tight and aggressive. They're very disciplined, never making fishy decisions. They skew aggressive, but they're not overly aggressive. They're provocative, so they're going to be taking aggressive actions a lot. Safe to assume that they probably have bluffs when in their 3-bet range and 4-bet range. And then they're proceeding with caution, and a lot of them are going to be also folding a lot. Basically playing like you should, right? You look at a solver, they're aggressive, they fold more than they call, especially in lower stakes. My pool's 25 NL, 50 NL, 100 NL, sometimes 200. So it's kind of in line with that mold of what you need to be successful. And then, yeah, they're going to try to steal the blinds a lot. So this kind of comes into that dynamic of button versus big blind, small blind versus big blind ranges is like needing to make sure that those are really studied. A lot of opportunities to 3-bet aggressively because people are going to be folding a lot and they're going to be opening too many hands from those late positions, or at least relative to the population. And then just toggling through some of these other ones, we have like a weak reg. So again, this just kind of makes them a little bit more middling. They're maybe a little looser than what these studied regs would be. They're more likely to make fishy decisions. They're going to be a little bit more passive than they are aggressive. So going to be doing a little bit more calling when entering pots, playing a lot more hands from the big blind instead of raising in. And then they're not going to be 3-betting nearly as much. So weak reg might not even be the best term for this now that I'm going over this, but in essence, you can kind of see the shape and the difference. We look over here to fish, and it's what we'd expect, right? Fish are loose, fish are fishy, fish are passive, they're very selective, they're not going to be taking aggressive actions much, and then they're curious, uncalibrated, and resistant. But what you'll notice, I think, and this is why it becomes really interesting to further segment these types down, is when you look at the range of outcomes from someone like a studied reg, it's really tight. But then we look at fish, and there's a whole wide spectrum of fish, right? And so again, this is really trying to dive into finding some of those individual traits. So while these are fish as a whole, we've calculated these trait metrics for every single player in the player pool, and we can begin to try to use those, especially as we get more data on more players, to be able to figure out and analyze what these different types of fish might be doing in different situations, as opposed to just being a fish or a reg. And then so in this case, and then just one little last one here, we have Maniac, and again, loose, occasionally doing some fishy things, but they're aggressive, they're provocative, they are gonna call a lot. So like they're your prototypical opening a lot of hands, but they're not going anywhere when they're calling, those types of players. And then as we look into post-flop stats, the NAT, the idea of that, and post-flop's a little harder to always kind of predict just because it's harder to get hands, hard to get showdowns, so these traits aren't going to be quite as indicative or close as the pre-flop types. But the idea about like a NAT is someone who's going to be fighting for pots, they're going to be c-betting a lot, they're going to be double barreling, triple barreling a lot, but they're going to be using a lot of small sizing. They're just kind of buzzing around you, you know, being annoying. They're probing a lot when you check to them, or stabbing. They're a little sticky, but kind of balanced realistically. They'll occasionally get in there and raise you a little bit. But again, using a lot of small sizing, they're really timid. These are probably players that you could exploit in certain ways, especially if we know they're going to probe small. Hands that might normally want to bet for value might want to check just to take advantage of the fact that they're going to probe a bunch, that type of thing. The transparent player, on the other hand, they are kind of like balanced. They don't c-bet a ton. They're kind of right in the middle of the range, but then they don't fight for pots. So what I see when I view this kind of a thing and we look at like a transparent player was this would be someone who, like, if I'm in the big blind, I'm going to be calling way wider when we see this type of player, because I'm not worried about trying to be super balanced. If they bet, I'm just going to assume they have something, because they're already in the middle. And then if they check, I know I can just bluff them off, because they're not going to fight for pots. They're going to skew much more into like this flight mentality. So probably a lot of profit to be gained when we start seeing like those combinations of traits. Meanwhile, they, ironically enough, probe a decent amount. And then again, very nitty. So we can basically kind of assume here that if they're these nittier players that are likely to be overfolding, especially to our bets, Probably not. We got to be a lot more selective with our double barrel bluffs because when they do call, more likely they're going to have a good hand if they're going to be folding a majority of the time. And then they're not raising. So when they do check raise, we want to make sure we have a lot of really good implieds or we have good redraw because they probably have it more often than not. Same sort of thing here, using a lot of weak sizing. So when they use big sizing, they're probably just telegraphing their hand a little bit. I should also caveat, these are kind of my interpretations right now. I haven't done the deep dive to back this up with data, but I think it makes kind of like a logical conclusion based on how these traits were calculated. Then we come into the Punisher. These people are fighting for pots. They're using huge sizing all the time. They're playing pretty balanced as like the caller. They're doing just the right amount of probing, the right amount of stabbing. They're betting a lot. They're really sticky. They're going to raise you a ton, and they're going to use huge sizing even as like the caller. So these are the situations where maybe when they're in the blinds, it's best not to potentially maybe continue with some of those weaker offsuit hands, especially early, because if there's not a situation where we get to check back and realize our equity, they're going to be really difficult to play against. And then the same when calling from the big blind. And then our last player type here is kind of the monk. And my thought of naming this one is like, these are the Zen, they're passive, they just want to see a showdown. Like, let's see the hands, let's just get to the bottom of it. So they're not betting much at all, even when they're the aggressor. They're kind of right in the middle, getting that very Zen. They're gonna fight a little bit for pots, but not overly much. They're not gonna fold a ton though. Let's just try to see a showdown. Very middling sizing. They're only reacting. They're never gonna bet unless it's their job to bet. If they're calling, they're always just gonna react, go in the flow of the game. Let's see the showdown. Super average, like a good mix between being like nitty and sticky. Kind of that same mentality. Let's see a showdown. Let's not raise. Let's not stir the pot. Let's not use big sizing. That's kind of the thought. And ultimately, what I want to be able to do is use these player types to effectively say and use the same format that a lot of our coaches would do inside the hand channels, which is when we're posed in a situation, what should we do in theory? What does our range want to do? What does our hand want to do? And then how does that deviate, or what are some other adjustments we need to make based on these types of players? And so my thought in all of this is essentially coming to something like the hand review. And then let's go back to the 10-8 section of things. And here I'd say like 10-8. In theory, we are supposed to fold. But now once we incorporate that player information in there, and we know that, let's say that they were that passive, transparent player, this I think could become a profitable call, or it's at least a justification for becoming a profitable call. And so that's where I want to be able to kind of categorize and grade these things as like theoretical mistakes, exploitative mistakes, just like, and then a blunder would be if you're doing it all wrong. Like, you messed up in theory and you did the exact opposite thing you should do. Like if I was playing against an aggressive Punisher type, I probably shouldn't even be like calling with 5-2 suited here, because the chances of me being able to realize any equity that I have there are so small, it's probably better just to fold. And so those are some of the kind of frameworks that I want to start building into this as we go from player by player, hand by hand, and then start scripting this out so that once you're done with the session, everything can get automated together. Just mock data in the flop and turn, but the situation would be the same thing. We see a scenario, maybe someone raises us after we c-bet. If there's someone who is relatively contained and doesn't check raise much, then maybe we should just fold when theory would continue. So that's kind of my goal of how I want to start synchronizing some of these things together. But how do we actually figure out what we're supposed to do in theory? In some of these later streets. Preflop is easy. There are ranges everywhere. There are ranges for every stake, every depth size, every configuration. That can be imported in no problem, and those comparisons are relatively trivial, which is how we're able to see what we're showing on the screen right now. But in order to know if something's good in theory, your first instinct might be, well, I should go check a solver. But my problem with solvers is that effectively, right, it's just brute force computers playing against each other millions and millions and millions of times until they reach an equilibrium. They just say, hey, I'm now unexploitable, and I'm unexploitable in a way that doesn't cause me to lose EV. Like I'm just maximizing that EV while also being unexploitable. And a lot of the study is just us deriving meaning to the solver. But I wanted to kind of take things a step backward and try to use those same theoretical principles that we learn in Carrot Poker School and all these other sections and build a more comprehensive bet EV approximator that builds on these, but then allows explainability because we're starting with the core principle and using that to say, why do we classify a hand this way? What does our range want to do? What does our hand want to do? So just as an example here, I'm going to start here and just use a little hand selector, and I'm going to go early position, and we'll just say I have ace 5, and I raise mid position folds, cutoff folds, button folds, small blind folds, big blind calls. And then let's pick a board that we just absolutely smash. So we'll go like king of diamonds, jack of clubs, and then just like some brick, 2 of spades. We know just from playing a lot that this board absolutely crushes. So let's go ahead and calculate that. And now we're going to see what is our hand's equity. Our hand only has 35% equity, but our range is 63% equity, which is a huge advantage. And we maintain a ridiculous nut advantage as well. This being like, what's that percentage of like our top hands as a proportion of our range versus the percentage of the big blind's range, and then how well do those do against each other. And then you can see here, we can see our raising range, we can see the calling range, and then we have our equity distribution charts. But then what I also wanted to be able to do, and this isn't complete yet, but this is going to form the basis for how all of the grading of sessions is essentially going to do, is pick a size, and then based on that size, I want to be like very careful with how I represent some of these things, right? Because minimum defense frequency theoretically should only be used on the river in a pure theory perspective, but it allows us to at least back into some of these approximate ranges. And so what we're essentially saying is if we're betting 20% of the time, we know that MDF is 83.3%. That doesn't mean in theory that we should, but at least gives us kind of a starting point to figure out if they were to call, how does that condense their range? And then how can we start looking at equities versus when we landed versus what they're going to be continuing and defending against. And the thought process is, and even on boards that we smash, I created like another approximation called actual defense frequency, which is just effectively trying to find hands that have sufficient enough pot odds in order to be able to meet MDF. So in this case here, we'll see that MDF is supposed to be 74.1, but only 73.3% of the range actually had sufficient enough equity to justify the pot odds needed to call B50s even smaller. And where you'll see this actually be significantly more pronounced will be situations, right, where maybe it's actually the early position, I would say on the button, and early position raises. Actually, we'll just go to the cutoff. So we'll say cutoff raises. I raise now with ace 5, and small blind folds, big blind folds, and that broke. So let me do with early position. So button raises, small blind folds, big blind folds, and then our early position here is going to call. And now we're actually going to make the flop something like 3, 2, 2. We now have all of the overpairs, and this is then where we get to see potentially some even more stark differences when it comes to like nut advantage and rain advantage. We change the board to, let's say, even be like king, king, 2. We get to begin like calculating that. And then these different charts populate. That actual defense frequency and the minimum defense frequency are always gonna change. But just for the sake of going back to our previous example, we can go back to early position. We can again select whatever card we want and come back through here to the big blind. And now let's pick a board that we know big blind's gonna smash. So let's just do 7, 6, 5 rainbow, and we calculate this. And now we're going to see a very, very stark difference. Our range equity is actually only 47%. We are at a disadvantage, and we do not have a lot of the nuts that are actually happening here. And then we can start diving into saying, okay, this right now is calculating, these are the percentage of hands that want to bet for this size, and then the percentage of hands that want to check for this size. And effectively what I tried to do when baking this out was saying, what is our approximate expected value from betting versus our approximate expected value from checking? And so when we dive into clicking on this betting ratio here, we can then pull up an overview that's going to have a lot more details. So in this case, we have our situation. Our opponent's supposed to defend 66.7% of the time. We're assuming on this board they do so. And then this is kind of the ratio of our makeup of all the hands that want to bet for this size. And I'll get a little bit more into that, but 53% can bet for value, 21% would be considered hybrids, and then just some other stuff within here. And we can kind of like look at this, and obviously some of our highest equity hands, right, are going to be top set. So we have something like 7 of diamonds, 7 of clubs. This has 88% raw equity. You can think of raw equity as landing equity. So against the entire range that Big Blind called the flop with, we're going to win 88% of the time if we just get to run this out. However, if we bet for 50% of the pot, the range is obviously going to condense. They're not going to defend all of their hands. And so this is where we can look at that defending range analysis here. We can see that the best hands that they're clearly obviously going to defend either through raising or calling are going to be a straight, 9 of clubs, 8 of clubs. This is the worst hands that they're potentially going to be defending with. Again, these aren't solver outputs, these are approximated values. A lot of their ace 10 off is essentially going to be hands that are going to be continuing. And then some of the hands that they're going to be getting to fold, those top folding hands are going to be things like 10 of hearts. Actually, might need to look into this. I don't know if they should be folding open-enders here. Again, things to sort out. But basically, this is kind of the premise of how we're trying to shape some of these ranges as we're going through this. And so then how we determine if it's better to bet than to check is because we're in position, we know that if we check, we get to realize the equity that we came into the flop with and see a free card. So our checking equity is literally just going to be the raw equity that we have that we win the hands. And then I just took out rake. That's why you're not seeing a straight 88% here, because we're assuming 5% of any winnings we get are going to go to the house. So it is worth 83.6% of the pot effectively here to check, because we're going to win 77 or 88% of the time. And then we want to compare that to bet. Bet is a little trickier because we're obviously going to win some of the times right away. They're going to be folding 33% of the time, so we're going to be winning 100% of the pot 33% of the time just by them folding. So that is an immediate gain and a reason for betting. And then we're going to win 85.2% of the time against that range. So we're going to win a bigger pot 85.2% of the time, but then we're losing 15% of the time. So that 50% pot investment, we might lose 15% of the time as well. And so those all get factored in to then calculate this bet EV. So obviously, it goes without saying, all of our highest equity hands are going to be wanting to bet, and they're going to be considered value bets because they're getting a lot of benefit from just building the pot now. They're good hands. They're oftentimes getting called by worse. So in this case, even though we only have 88% equity and only winning 85.2% of the time, right now, when we get called, we're ahead in this particular spot 94.6% of the time. So always getting called for the most part by hands that are worse. It's just going to be like those straights like 8-9, 4-3 that we're going to be losing to. And as we scroll down a little bit here, we're going to start getting out of the value hands, and now we're going to get into hybrids. And so if we've taken the school, we know hybrids have the benefit from being called by worse, but also getting a lot of equity denial as well. So in this case, I didn't classify this as a value hand because we actually don't retain more than 55% equity heading into the turn when we're bet. It's right on the threshold. So, but we're also getting called by worse 71% of the time. 71% of their continuing range is going to be worse than king 7. We can see some of those examples here: 8-7, 8-6, 7-4. These are all going to be types of hands that have relatively high equity, but they're going to be calling that are worse than king 7. And then we also have some examples that are supposed to fold where we're really benefiting from equity denial. We're folding out a 10 or an 8. We're folding out an ace. We're folding out an ace or a 10. These are then going to be potentially hands that fold. So that's why this is a hybrid. It has two purposes. It's not quite strong enough to be perfectly considered a value bet, although it's obviously at the top of that range, but it's getting called by worse a lot of the time, and it's denying a lot of equity. So good to just win the pot now. And then that is shown here by comparing the bet EV approximated versus the check EV. And there's going to be some weird hands. And this is where, as I work through this, I'll probably start tweaking this a little bit as maybe hands that shouldn't bet. But we take a look at something like ace of diamonds, ace of diamonds, ace of hearts, 8 of hearts. These have backdoor equity. They have open-ended straight draws. So the reason why bet EV is still slightly higher than check EV is because they still benefit from all three phases. They're actually sometimes folding out worse hands, although barely. They're occasionally going to be folding out ace 10. You're getting called by worse sometimes. You're occasionally getting called by some open-enders like king 8, open-enders on the other side with an overcard like ace 4. Again, these aren't solver proof per se. It's just more illustrating the concept of why we want to take certain actions. And so yeah, we're denying a lot of equity. We're still maintaining a decent amount of equity when called, but we're not value betting. We're not folding better. So even though technically you could argue the bet EV is bigger than check EV, depending on the rest of the composition of our range, like let's say we have too many bluffs already, this could be a good candidate to just slot into that checking range because it's not bad to bet, but it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot, except maybe building the pot for when we hit our open-ender. Some more hybrids. Then we have this kind of categories, right, of semi-bluffs. So king of clubs, 8 of clubs. We're occasionally getting called by something like queen 8 or king 4, but obviously not often getting called by worse much at all. And we're not retaining even 50% of the pot when we bet, but we do have the added benefit of often folding out when they are folding. 47.5% of that folding range is better than our king 8, and that's because we're folding a bunch of ace highs, hands like king 9. I'm not actually sure again if this gutter in this situation would fold with the backdoor, but either way, kind of more just to illustrate the principle. Folding better, retaining equity. This is a great semi-bluff candidate, and you'll see that obviously the gap here is going to be significantly larger between betting and checking than when we have some of these hybrid hands. And then we then just have like the actual bluffs as well. So these actual bluffs like jack, hearts, 10 of hearts. In this case, we don't even have an immediate draw. These are just backdoors both at the time. But when we bet with jack 10 of hearts, the hands that are getting folded are almost, in this case, always better. Around 83% of that folding range is actually going to be beating our jack 10 of hearts. So when we get folds, it's huge. Hands like 8 queen of diamonds is potentially folding. Again, I doubt it. Ace of spades, 3 of spades, ace 10 off. These are hands that are folding, getting a ton of equity denial when they fold. And we retain just enough equity to make our bet EV relative higher than our check EV with something like a double backdoor. But then conversely, we like maybe take this to a different board structure where let's say we go like 2-2-2. We just have like trip 2s on here. And we want to run this again. Again, we're now maintaining a big range advantage, big nut advantage, and we can go in and start analyzing these different bet sizes. So let's go in and look at maybe B50 again. We see that same composition. We see the types of hands and the equity that they have for betting. And so now we can start seeing that this is basically all just hybrids and value bets in terms of hands that want to bluff here, just because they're going to need to defend in a really awkward way, and our range advantage can really just be maximized, because everything they're supposed to continue with is probably going to be a little bit worse. But then we can also look at our checking ratio and start to analyze and see some of the hands where it just comes a lot more natural to check in this situation. In this case, we see like king of diamonds, queen of diamonds, 2 overcards. We got the equity based on B50 and the top folding hands that are actually happening here. All of the best folding hands are basically queen highs, so it's expecting king highs to essentially continue almost pure, so we're never folding better. We're denying equity. We get to deny equity against anything that has 2 live outs against us, but a lot of the times it's just a situation where we're going to win 51% of the time against their range. Let's just realize that tons of overs that we can easily boat up on, and we're not retaining nearly as much equity against their defending range when we get called. So once this feature gets fleshed out, this is then going to be kind of the basis for how we start grading everything. So now we might have a situation where you are in a situation and you're on this board, and somebody, let's say, is the player type who is nitty, but they are someone who probes. They're like that nat type, but they play on like also the transparent side. That's a situation then where if we think that they're going to overprobe, this quickly becomes a spot where maybe we now want to deviate because we think and then we want to bluff more because they're going to fold a lot of their hands, they're going to play really transparently, but then they're going to overprobe, they're going to overstab when it comes to it. And that's ultimately the flow I want to bake out. And so all of this type of logic would then be able to essentially be fed from the hand histories that come from the session, and that's then going to power an interface that is going to be indicative of what we just walked through here in the hand review. We take something like ace 4 of me defending against a 3-bet, and in this case raising it. So this is me and squeezing, and then we would look at those ranges and then try to evaluate what we should do on subsequent streets when it comes to the flop. But ideally, it would be explaining in this situation, our hand wants to do this, our range wants to do this. Against this player, we should be thinking in this way. So maybe if we come to king here, this was our MP open. King get called by the big blind, and then we have a situation like what we described here. What do we want to do with our range? What do we want to do with our hand? And then how should that determine our best action? And then how could that best action be different based on what we know about how pool responds in these types of situations? But none of this is useful, again, if we can't immediately feed these insights back into Poker Tracker or whatever we're using as our HUD so that we can begin to act on these things right away. It is great, obviously, if we can come in, hit setup, import hands, see how well we played, but we also want to go the other way around. We have so much valuable information on all of these different player types that exist here that it would be kind of lame if we just had to try to memorize that as a general heuristic. And that's also one of the faults I have with solver work as well as MDA is you see something and then you're just kind of expected to memorize it or understand why you're supposed to do it in a particular spot. But if we can identify meaningful exploits against pool, the technology I use behind the scenes not only allows us to import hands from Poker Tracker, but I can actually sync these things back to Poker Tracker as well. And this is where I'm going to pivot the conversation and actually begin to talk about my development methodology here. So I'm going to try to, and I haven't tried it yet, so you're going to be seeing this, me literally trying to develop a new feature without attempting it before to create the HUD sync so that all of the information about the players we collected can get synced back to Poker Tracker so that when we play a session, I'll hope to have a stream on the Discord and record that as well so you can eventually see what that looks like. But I want to be able to sync all this player data back to Poker Tracker 4 and auto color every single player in my player pool based on their traits, and also assign notes based on some of these traits that we think that we're like pretty excessive in. So I'm going to walk through a little bit about how I would approach something like that. And here's where the AI piece begins to come in a little bit. So first off, I'm going to actually pull up and open up our database here. For those of you who care, it's called DuckDB. Basically, it's just a super fast columnar store designed for heavy analytics that runs on your local and is super lightweight. So things that, like I said, would take 30 seconds to run in a Poker Tracker 4 report can return in like less than a second here in DuckDB. And the two main things I really want to talk about today is I have a data set where all of our players and their traits and their cluster assignments were defined. So when I click run here, this is then going to show us all the players. We'll do some shout outs to some players in the pool. So we're going to go where player name is in, and we'll see if I actually remember how to spell it, but we'll go Stonky and Snugglespud, just so we can kind of compare how we play against each other. And I'm just going to make sure I lowercase this because I don't remember how to spell. And yeah, it worked. So here we have Stonky, and here we have me, Snugglespud. We're the same player. This is pre-cluster 3, which is studied reg, and post-cluster 2, which I don't actually remember off the top of my head. I would hope it's Punisher. I feel like that would be really fun. But either way, then we can start looking at some of these traits. And so if we think of these traits, there are a lot of decimals here. That's again why I'm trying to assign these things to more English terms. But 0 is your average player in the pool. And then anything negative is going to be someone who skews more to the one side of the spectrum, and anything positive is going to skew to the other side of the spectrum. So in this case here, we would see that I'm a little tighter than Stonky, which I actually find a little surprising given some of my antics that I have against him. Maybe it's just what I've observed. He is a little more aggressive than me. He's more disciplined than me. He is more cautious than me, and he's more provocative than me. So probably just all around a better player, to be perfectly honest. I will fold a little bit more to 3 bets and the like. I'm going to be a little bit more calibrated. I'm not looking to steal quite as much from these later positions. He is very much on the uncalibrated side, it appears, at least based on the amount of hands that I have on him. He's looking to steal a lot. And then as we move post-flop, we're both relatively balanced, so we're not actually over c-betting. We're coming into the subdued side as the pre-flop aggressor. I actually think this is probably an area I could improve. I'm a little bit too worried about maybe being protected, and I probably should just be a bet a little bit more. But anyway, he's more subdued than me. We're both going to fight for pots, but I'm going to fight a lot more for pots. He is using a lot of small sizing as the pre-flop aggressor, again, based on my observations, whereas I'm using a lot bigger sizing. I'm going to probe a lot more than he is, so I'm probably going a little too hard exploit and attacking those checking ranges relative to him. And we're both around the same amount of sticky. And again, this is again relative to the median. So sticky probably actually indicates that we're actually continuing the proper amount in certain situations. And then he's way more volatile than me. So this means that he's check raising a lot. I'm not check raising nearly as much. So these are situations where against a player like Stonky, right, I'm going to be like, okay, I'm not just going to overfold. I'm going to need to stay around and fight for pots when he's check raising me. And then meek to strong. This is again where I think is kind of interesting. I still use larger sizing than he does when I'm the pre-flop defender. This like 0.86 relative to the mean versus 0.63. But when you compare that to his reserve to dominating trait, this is saying that he uses smaller sizing as the pre-flop aggressor relative to pool. So relative to how the rest of the pool is c-betting and the sizing they're using in those sizes, he he actually uses a lot smaller sizing. I use bigger sizing. But when he is the defender, he's using really big sizing when he takes opportunities to probe. So again, kind of highlights, just because you bet big doesn't mean you bet big in all the same situations. He's going to be using larger sizings a lot more as the defender than when he's the aggressor. But we can then now use kind of this understanding for me to create a requirement stock for myself to go develop something. So what I like to do is I have a little tool called Whisperflow, which is just a voice transcriber. And I like to bring up Claude and use Claude to essentially help me write a prompt that I'm ultimately going to send into my AI development arena. And so here is what I essentially want to do. I'm just going to literally go stream of consciousness while holding control here, and I'm going to then have Claude convert that into a prompt that I can use to help me develop this feature. Can you help me write a prompt to give to an AI developer that allows me to take the insights that I've generated in our DuckDB database and write that back to the Postgres database that we are connected to within the application? There should already be plenty of existing code that imports the PG package for DuckDB, and lots of existing code that shows how we can write from Postgres in the Poker Tracker 4 database to DuckDB. So I'll need you to research how we've previously coded some of those existing workflows. But the main difference is we are going to be now going the opposite direction. So instead of reading from Postgres, let's actually read from DuckDB and use that to write to Postgres. And so now that transcribed it, it's in here. I'm going to go in and just create another little section. And so I just said that was the task for now. I'm going to add an area for details. And so this is the data that we have that I want to basically bring into Poker Tracker to use for color coding, use for those types of things, right? But this is the table here that is based off of notes. So these are all the notes that we probably have on different players, and this is the effectively the schema that would exist within Postgres. So there's a node ID, there's an ID X, which essentially just represents the player that we have the note on, and then we have some of these notes on our different players, and then the color that we color coded them to. So this is going to be what I actually want to take our insights on the player pool and push it back into Poker Tracker. So I'm now going to pop back over into Claude and describe everything that I think it needs in order to be able to understand this table. In order to be able to implement this feature, you're going to need to understand two tables. First, you'll need to understand the table pokercompanion.main.ddb_notes. This is effectively the clone of the notes table that we brought in from our Poker Tracker 4 Postgres database. So you're going to want to understand that schema as well as the primary key. So that was me just telling it the details about the data that we already have. This table directly corresponds to the notes table in the Postgres public schema. So it would be public.notes. And that was then just me giving it some more details to let it understand where it's going to be writing to. The important columns in the notes table that are of note is that ID_note is the primary key. This should always be unique for every single note that will be taken on a player. The enum type, ENUM_TYPE, is whether or not the note is on a player or something else. For our purposes, that value will always be equal to the letter P. And then there is ID underscore X, which is going to be the unique identifier associated with that enum type. So in this case, ID X will always correspond to the player ID. There are some other columns that we can safely ignore. Flag underscore tournament, for our purposes, will always be false. ID underscore game type, we can safely always default to 0. The date underscore note will just end up being the timestamp associated with when we choose to complete this sync. And the ID color is going to correspond to the color coding that we'll eventually want to do. This is a value ranging from 0 to 8, where 0 is an absence of color, and then we can get to the mapping of the colors later. And then the note field will be the actual note that we are taking on a particular individual. This is just a free-form text field. And then the note TS vector column, we can just always leave as null. I'm not sure what it's for, it's irrelevant. So again, I'm just continuing to give it details of what we want to be able to do. And now I'm going to add in a requirements. We want to effectively take data that is stored in the view pokercompanion.views.v underscore combined player profile and traits. We want to use that information to create unique rows for notes and to write back notes to that Postgres database, as well as color code those players based on certain types. You'll need to analyze the schema of that view, and we're now going to provide you some of the trait rules of how we want to classify and assign notes. For the column tight to loose, if a player has a value that is less than -0.25, we want to consider them tight. If they have a value that is greater than 0.25, we want to consider them loose. For the column passive to aggressive, if they have a value that is greater than 0.1, we want to consider them aggressive, and if they have a value that is less than -0.1, we want to consider them passive. For the column discipline to fishy, if they have a value less than -0.25, we want to consider them disciplined. And if they have a value greater than 0.25, we want to consider them fishy. For the field cautious to curious, if they have a value less than -0.5, we want to consider them cautious. If they have a value greater than 0.5, we want to consider them curious. For selective to provocative, if they have a value greater than 0.25, we want to consider them provocative. If they have a value less than -0.25, we want to consider them selective. for yielding to resistant. If they have a value that is less than negative 0.25, we want to consider them yielding. And for any value greater than 0.25, we want to consider them resistant. Then I actually only have so much time. I gotta run soon, so we'll kind of leave it at that. But basically, I'm gonna then hit enter to have Claude synthesize this into a prompt, and then we're actually going to get developing. It is actually searching the web, so I don't think I wanted it to quite be as crazy as this, but whatever. It's going to actually draft us the document, I guess, as a prompt. So we will see what happens there. But anyway, for now, I'll actually just copy and paste these transcribed values and just go directly into the interface that I use to code. So I'm now going to exit out of here and pull up my IDE. This is, for anyone who's never seen it, is where people code. These are all the files in the directory. This is my little AI agent panel where I can either have it write code or I can ask it questions. I mainly use this for debugging and things. And this is the terminal where I actually run the application and do all the testing and everything. What I'm going to do is actually close out the terminal, and my main we'll call it like daily driver for coding is in something called a terminal user interface, which is going to essentially allow me to work with different agents that are better at certain tasks. So I'm going to go in here, and it's called open code. So I'm going to open code, and it kind of just looks like an old school video game, right? And then you'll see I have these agents here at the bottom. There's build. I use Git Copilot. That's because I get a membership, so it's effectively free, or at least I'm not paying for any increased usage. I have a plan agent, which uses a model that I personally think is the best at a lot of these complex coding situations. And then I also just have some other more expensive ones if I hit a wall and need to push through that use GPT-5. But we're going to go ahead with the planner agent, and literally I'm just copying and pasting what came from, did I do the right thing? What came from that cloud output. I hope I pasted the right thing, and I did. Cool. Yeah, so this is then going to work, and now it is going to go and try to take that prompt and figure out how to go build that feature. So it's going through, it found the view, it's now going through and reading the rest of my code base. It's finding out how I'm connecting to Postgres here. And then, yeah, it read all that, and then it created a prompt for me. So it essentially wants to implement a one-way sync that reads player insights from DuckDB and writes them into PokerTracker4's Postgres database. Woohoo! That's exactly what we want to do. A lot of our logic already lives places. It found out where we established the connection to Postgres that already exists. It found out where we're importing data, and then it found out how we are, and it has the view of how we want to do certain things. It describes the view. It provided the details of the column that we're going to be setting to, and then it brought us our rules that we created. So that's all listed here. I didn't actually tell it to do this, but it is trying to map the colors to type aggressive and passive. So we're just going to roll with it for the sake of this example. And then it brought in some of these functional requirements. And then I'm just going to add in one thing and say, hey, this implementation plan looks good. The one call out is that I want it to be triggered when we click the sync HUD submenu item from our application menu. And so I'm just, in this case, telling it that like, that's what I want to associate it with. And so I'll tell it this little bit of information. It'll update the details here. And then what I can then do is simply just copy this entire prompt. And then I can go over here and pivot to my build agent and actually tell it what to do. I'm on a fresh, I've already committed all my changes to Git, so if something goes horribly wrong, it's totally fine. I can just revert back, and all I did was waste the 40 minutes I probably spent rambling at you, which, as we all know, is not really a waste. I hope I'm not boring you to death. So then we'll go ahead and paste that prompt in. And now it's just going to start getting to work. And what it'll do first is it's actually going to plan and create a little checklist for us. So in this case, it is going to create a plan for the creating and then a plan for updating. So it's now going to go through and start going through these. And then I put some guidelines in here that if it's going to run any commands that I'm not comfortable with or edit any code that I don't want to happen, it's going to show me the code diffs. So right now it's just reading all of the information it thinks it's needing, and now it's creating, wants to create the actual Postgres sync module, which would be the code that it's going to try to use to write back to Postgres. And then it's going to be preparing for a little bit. And this is probably a good time to leave you and end the video. But what I'm hoping happens after I hit stop recording is that I will actually fully build this feature, and then we'll actually get an opportunity to watch me play either before I head to Greece or while I'm in Greece, so we can see how this feature that we built on this video together ultimately transpires into how all the software that I showed you can be used to take data and those insights and push it back into Poker Tracker 4, where you ultimately want to play. In this case, it wrote a bunch of code. For the sake of this video, I'm actually not going to try to read it or pretend I know what it is. But you'll notice here, it's basically just saying before it runs it, it's waiting for me to either accept or reject the changes. I'm just going to accept them. And then it's going to go through and add this to our commands file so that our application knows that we have a new section here. And this is actually saying it's a DuckDB feature so that I can test features a lot faster if we don't want to. So it's just adding the feature it's associated with. And then it's basically coming in and saying, hey, when this is the case, we want to be able to enable that feature. I hit accept. It registers it in the library of all of our functions. I hit accept. And now it's actually going to try to connect that button to it. And now it basically just wants us to test it. So it is right now just going to check the code. So as far as we know, it just built the feature that we told it to build. It's now just waiting to run the check. So the cool thing about all of these tools is all these languages are really extensively documented. There's a lot of rules that are community sourced that are just kind of considered best practices. And so this little spinny wheel on the bottom here is basically just going through. It's making sure that all the code that this computer wrote here is valid. And so it's running through and doing those checks. And kind of how this bridges from where I'm building the feature to then debugging is a lot of times if this does follow an error, I like to be able to maintain two separate workplaces. So as this is working, I still have my little agent panel here over the side. So I can now go over and ask an agent, hey, like, what is the coldest month of the year in Brazil, and it'll go through. I can ask it questions about my code if I'm trying to plan a future feature. I can have it actually update or do parallel debugging in other files while I'm waiting for some of this stuff to happen. So just a little way that I try to actually balance my productivity is I'll be using the terminal as my driver, and I will be using this to do other subsequent kind of concepts here. And so yeah, it compiled successfully. There were no errors in the code. And now it's reading to figure out how stuff should be loaded. Yep, they noticed that there was some metadata stuff. Okay, yeah, just found something that I guess it did wrong before, that it shouldn't have changed. It should be, using the password, which is what we want. We might actually quickly be able to get to see if this works. So it's testing it one more time. If this somehow works live, I'm going to be, I don't know. There's no way. It's going to error, but we'll see what happens. I do have a 5:30 dinner reservation, though. Luckily, I'm good at speed walking. Oh, it found errors. Okay, it found errors. So we'll just kind of end there, but hopefully this conveyed a little bit about how I'm approaching this project, why I think this could be a really useful tool for people to play, why I think having a companion to sit alongside you and immediately give you feedback after your sessions, as well as the ability to harness all this data that you're collecting on your pool and feeding that back into the tools that you actually use, like your heads-up displays, could be really meaningful. And then yeah, that was my update. It looks like we're clocking in at, holy shit, 1 hour and 7 minutes. So if you lasted this long, thanks for staying with me, and hopefully I'll be in a situation where I'll actually get to be showing you how this works in the field and some plain explains on using the feature that we just designed and created with each other. So until next time, I might not have as many updates from Greece, but talk soon.